Everyone hear me? Can Twitter hear me? YouTube? However, okay, I see nodding. All right, so to begin this presentation to you all, I would like to disclose that I have PTSD. My internalized ableism tells me this doesn't make me qualified to talk about my disability in the academy, not only because my disability is invisible, but also because the amount of good days I have are finally starting to outweigh the bad. I have tried hard in this paper to distance myself enough to talk about this topic without panicking, without crying, without focusing on myself, but I have not entirely succeeded, and for that I am sorry. As a white cis woman who passes for straight, my experiences are far from universal, but I'm giving this talk to continue the conversations about academic ableism, which have been happening online for years now. I look forward to any time at the end where we can all talk about this topic in more detail and listen to a phrase that might bring us some kind of comfort. We are not alone. This paper comes in 3 parts, and each one could potentially trigger those who identify as survivors or have experienced any kind of institutional discrimination. My first part is particularly triggering to myself as I discuss the difficulties of navigating institutional resources that are set up to fail students. The second speaks directly to the need to adequately perform trauma to graduate school faculty and peers, and will have some pretty harsh language. The last brainstorms possible solutions to the current model of disability services for graduate students. I will be taking a strong stance on this topic, and at times I will fail to discuss the complexities of these issues, but that's what Twitter and the Unconference is for. So, I come from a large research-one university, the University of Wisconsin at Madison, which seems to mean I come from a deeply decentralized campus. I should clarify, we have shared governance, which gives representation to faculty, staff, and students, though Joyce, in her talk, just gave an excellent critique into this model, so I will not go into the complications of this now. And we also have a strong push to make research more interdisciplinary. However, campus resources, particularly for students, are often just a large, confusing sea of brochures. Because I did my undergraduate degree at the same university, I was very lucky. Before my abuse, I had 2 years on campus, a luxury few graduate students are afforded. I was familiar with the resources available to me through dorm meetings and friends, magnets on my fridge, and the resources available to me through the University Health Services, where I utilized their services for basic things like the flu. When my abuse happened to me, I went to mental health services. From there, I talked to a therapist and was told I needed to go to survivor services to see a counselor. From there, I was able to get basic accommodation letters that I could give to my professors and bosses, and then it was recommended I go see a psychiatrist. At the psychiatrist, I was required to see primary care, who instructed me I should also see a nutritionist because maybe that would help with the physical symptoms I was enduring. By this time, I was dealing with the professors who didn't accept the accommodation letter because it didn't come through our Disability Services Center. So I went to our Disability Services Center, which meant I needed more paperwork from my psychiatrist and my counselor, who work in completely different divisions. I was also advised to go to the Office of Equity and Diversity because most of my bosses would not accept accommodations from the Student Disability Center, even though I was a student worker. Everything required an in-person meeting with someone far busier than I, even though at one point I was doing 15 credits with 5 jobs. My abuse happened 2 years ago, and I am still filling out paperwork. I am still being batted around from office to office. I never pressed charges on my abuser because I didn't want to have to relive the experiences, and I didn't want to constantly need to retell the stories. And I didn't want to be stuck in a bureaucracy that didn't want me to succeed, yet here I am. It goes without saying this should be less complex. It should also go without saying that I should have a proper advocate who has the ability to work with these different offices. My counselor works as my advocate, but because she works mainly with undergrads, I often function as a kind of guinea pig for how these various offices should be allowed to communicate, which, you guessed it, requires more paperwork. I wish it were as simple as making the decision to disclose, seeking out an academic advisor for help, and them telling me to go to health services. Instead, I ended up working with 6 different units in 4 different buildings before I was given the time of day by many of my professors. And I am the lucky one who realized these campus resources existed, and that if I tried and hoped and prayed hard enough, they would help. This constant advocacy work takes its toll. I am stretched too thin, and people often see me as not working to my full potential. I am not doing my real work, and therefore I am wasting my time and not actively trying to change my circumstances. To be honest, I am behind on most of my work, and I've asked for an incomplete almost every semester of grad school. However, I am also in continuous conversation with each professor and boss about my circumstances, and have tried playing nice every time I must disclose all over again at the beginning of each semester. This repetitive need to disclose destroys my dignity and reduces my trauma down to a logistical transaction. Proving that I need accommodations is by far the most difficult part of this kind of advocacy. I should clarify, I often don't have to prove what's going on to the myriad of doctors and mental health professionals I see. I have to prove it to my professors. It is one thing to explain that I have X, but Y helps. It is another to not only prove, but show you have X, but Y helps. What I mean by this is I must adequately perform my disability for them in order to gain enough trust or sympathy so that they will consider accommodating me. Mia Mingus has written about this as forced intimacy, where one must disclose personal parts of themselves to receive basic access. Personally, I call it trauma porn, where I must visibly be suffering and fit into the proper survivor stereotype, otherwise I am considered lazy. It's really fun because as graduate students, we must also look professional and competent. If I adequately perform, I will then be greeted with comments like, "Can't you just plan for your panic attacks?" This culture exists because graduate schools are set up to be hostile environments. We are expected to be self-sufficient and not need to utilize campus resources, so they are often not considered or they are looked down upon. This has been normalized for a long time, but I believe Wendy Brown summarizes the early 20th century theorist Max Weber best. Having a genuine vocation, there we go. Having a genuine vocation for something means being compelled and dedicated to the activity's worldly value, combined with the willingness to navigate and withstand often miserable conditions or rewards for pursuing it. I cannot articulate how disgusted I am with this quote. We should not be pushed to the breaking point in order to make up for the fact that we are not the straight, white, cis, able-bodied male of the past. There should not and cannot be a typical or normal graduate student. Academia must fight to be a more inclusive space. In light of complaints, I have seen graduate schools begin to discuss mental health issues, but I am often underwhelmed. Mental health is often construed as creating lectures on time management or crafting self-care stations, both of which are not inherently bad, but they don't actually address mental health or disability, particularly mental illness that results from being in graduate school. They treat it as though this is an individualized problem when it is actually a structural one. A blog called The Questioning Aspie discusses it best in relation to imposter syndrome, which is back here. This individualization of imposter syndrome lets the wider systems and structures that lead people to feel like they don't have a place within academia off the hook. Maria Accardi also writes about how the conversations involving burnout within librarianship obscures her battle with major depression. We must be wary when we talk about our struggles with things like imposter syndrome and burnout because we risk the normalization of stress becoming acceptable when it is actually a symptom of capitalist productivity bullshit. The pressure of grad school must stop being normalized. It is a problem for absolutely every student, but it actively keeps marginalized identities out of the conversation and out of the academy. To quote Wendy Brown again, public universities, I come from a public university, but I think it applies to many, must be consummately dedicated to educating and including in their research ranks those historically excluded by virtue of caste, class, religion, region, race, ethnicity, gender, and body. So, the solutions that I will discuss are not be-all, end-all solutions. I don't see them as particularly revolutionary or idealistic. I see them as the bare minimum for what should be done. 1, there must be better disability services set up to accommodate graduate students. There must be ways to articulate accommodations outside of the lecture hall and into the seminar room, and there must be broad-based institutional support networks. Many blogs have discussed this potential solution better than I will, but I recommend starting with blogs like PH Disabled and Chronically Academic. 2, professors must acknowledge the power dynamics between themselves and their students. I am reminded of 2 pieces posted in the Chronicle, Why I Dread the Accommodations Talk, and To My Student on the Death of Her Grandmothers. In these essays, the professors dehumanize their students and state that not only do they know their students' needs better than the student or the disability advocates, but that the students are lazy and lying. This is unacceptable behavior, and the Chronicle should be disgusted with itself. I understand that advising is labor-intensive work, and faculty don't typically receive much training or institutional incentives to do so, but publicly and privately condemning vulnerable students is deplorable. 3, professors must better support their students. In other words, they need to meet the students where they are at. In Hacking Graduate School for Neurodiverse Learners, Dr. Davina Tabor creates an imperfect guide for faculty members to engage with disabled students. In it, she writes, when professors assume the presence of core skills rather than teaching and supporting students, we reinforce inequity and disadvantage. The professor and student cannot be adversaries. A relationship of trust must exist, and the student must be comfortable going to their professor for help and advocacy. 4, know your rights. Rosemary Garland Thompson's piece, Developing Disability Cultural Competence, is one of my favorite condensed essays on this topic. She advocates for developing disability cultural competence, which is learning how to live effectively as a person with disabilities. Maybe it's not a sign. Learning how to live effectively as a person with disabilities, not just living as a disabled person trying to become non-disabled. She also speaks directly to the issues I have addressed above. Here. It should be the Disability Resources Center, not your supervisor with whom you discuss your access and accommodation needs. You should not disclose to your supervisors your medical diagnosis, but rather focus on the accommodations you require to carry out workplace expectations. And especially, your supervisors should not be deciding whether or not to grant you accommodations for your disabilities. We are allowed to fight back when we are being discriminated against. Maybe not in the large ways we sometimes want to, but as much as the disability services centers aren't meant for us, it can and will still help us. 5, we must take care of ourselves and our communities. It always bears repeating that we must take care of ourselves, but I also want to say that we must speak out. I know I am preaching to the choir here, but it took me a long time to decide to come here and give this paper, even longer to write it, but we must tell our stories. Nothing will change if we don't vocalize them. This kind of activism is not my field of research. I don't have the time or the energy, let alone the support, to be pursuing this kind of research. I fear being vocal about my disability will prevent me from working in the field that I want to. I fear retaliation from those in power, though I was funded to come to Boston and present this paper. Despite all of this, I agree with Lena Gluck, who said just this morning, the time for quiet librarianship is over. I also agree with the blogger, The Questioning Aspie, who writes, being a part of a community means you have a responsibility to it and to help shape it. We must challenge the institutions we are a part of, otherwise we are complicit in its oppression. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Questions from the audience or Twitter? Jessica, if you could take the mic to Puck. Puck, raise your hand.
Hello. Okay, it works. So my question is, do you have any advice for people who are, I guess, beginning their trying to get this disability access and accommodations journey, who might not even know what kind of accommodations to ask for?
No. So, most campuses do have very good disability resources centers. I cannot emphasize that enough, and I really love the one that I have on my campus. But I still have trouble articulating why I would like to turn a paper in a day late or a few hours late. It is a constant struggle that I have no good grasp of. There are a lot of resources online. I was thinking about making a handout, and I'll post it on Twitter, about resources that I have looked into for talking about accommodations, but really working with disability services to kind of shape what can and cannot be accommodated. I do not claim to say that I've fully accommodated by any means, but really being headstrong about it has gotten me quite far.
Hi, thank you so much for that presentation. I really appreciate so much of what you shared, especially today. I came a little bit late, but I feel like the personal stories are really driving home some points that I think are individual but speak to many experiences, especially people who have various marginalized identities across many ways and isms and things. I personally, I guess this is more of a comment, but it's interesting. I like the way that you broke down the steps that you have to take as the person impacted by your experience, and then having to go through all of these, what I would call gatekeepers, in order to get that recognized. I personally have a very similar experience as a trans person, and it's not easy sharing that with people, pointing those things out, because not everybody has the ability to envision why that would be difficult, and I think the thing that comes up again and again is like having to ask for that accommodation, for whatever that is. In this case, when you're speaking about disability, like I think about that a lot in terms of the students that I work with at the community college that I'm employed at, where we have a lot of neurodiverse students who are suffering from PTSD and have intellectual learning differences that they are so young, and they don't, not only do they not know that there are resources, and we are like a high-touch campus, but it's very scary for them to be able to actually come into like presence of mind to say, hey, this is a thing that's going on with me, And I think that that's something that I've learned a lot about with interacting with these students at the desk, and it's really, it's been powerful in the little like conversations that we have, like learning their stories. it helps me think about the things that I don't have any awareness of, but also having a way to point that back to things that I do recognize about the things that I've had to go through. So I really, I just want to thank you again for sharing that in detail, because that level of vulnerability, I think, is really important, because that you know, professionally, I think that ideally what would be good is if we can all continue to have a shared sense of humanity with other people. You know, everyone has to figure out where their boundaries are and what's going to work for them personally. I would never necessarily give anybody any advice directly for that. I think the one thing I would say is, in my experience, what's been very helpful for me is finding people that are allies. And the only way that that happened, though, is it was when I took that leap into disclose my trans identity or different things that I'm going through. People have actually stepped up for me in ways that I hadn't even considered were going to be a part of my experience. And it's not easy. It's never easy. It's still to this day, like, I get like a frog in my throat whenever I have to like openly disclose the different things that I'm experiencing. So I just, you know, today has been really powerful to see that with this presentation and Joyce's, and many of the presenters over the last 2 days have really blown me away with bringing it back to the individual story. So thanks again.
Thank you.
This is more of a comment. I think something that links what you're talking about and then also what Lena's talking about is an article that appeared in the Open Access Library Science Journal in the Library with the Lead Pipe back in January. This is an article by Fobazi Itar. It's called Vocational Awe and Librarianship, The Lies We Tell Ourselves. So I would really suggest that to people. Any more questions in the room or online?
I really appreciated your presentation, and it's really good to re-emphasize that we're not alone in this. And you know, I also have PTSD, and it's also been a super struggle to get through academia in general, and just day-to-day life sometimes. But and it is really powerful to be able to share stories with people, and it's something that I'm constantly trying to re-bring into conversations on, you know, equity and justice, is the idea that a lot of marginalized folks also are traumatized, and without accommodating for PTSD and like centering traumatized folks, you're overlooking a lot of communities that really need voice to talk. And so I really appreciate you bringing this topic to the forefront.
Thank you. I would also like to say a final thing. I participate in 3 support groups this semester. Our Survivor Services has been expanding since I have started there 2 years ago. Not because of me, but I'm just lucky enough to be riding that wave. And actually being able to talk to people outside of the library school has really helped. Calling back to yesterday morning's talk about, I guess, the beauty of the dual degree, being able to interact with people who you share an identity with is really valuable. The support groups have helped me, and also getting a dual degree in art history has really opened me up to a wide variety of people that I would not normally interact with in librarianship, particularly the people interested in contemporary art. Oh my gosh, they're so awesome.
Final thoughts or questions? Checking Twitter one more time. Okay, thank you so much for sharing with us.